a conversation with Dr. Michael R. Winston, historian and storyteller, part 3. Dr. Winston, it's great to see you again.
Thank you. It's great to be here again, Mr. Abebe.
All right. We'll continue from where we left off last time. You were telling us about some of Dr. Johnson's plans for Howard.
Well, I think I mentioned that the plan was to get each school and college at Howard University accredited and in a new, as he always put it, modern facility. And that was the clear but difficult objective because we had quite a number of schools and colleges. And in order to do that, the number of schools and colleges was reduced. And we went down to 8 schools and colleges. There were some that, and one of those that was slated to be closed was engineering. And the reason for that was that American prejudice was such that it was very difficult for our graduates to get employed as engineers. And it wasn't simply the accreditation status of the School of Engineering and Architecture. It was that there was a requirement in nearly every jurisdiction that before you could become a licensed engineer, you had to have been in an apprentice situation sometimes. So you needed a degree and then you needed work experience. And they wouldn't hire black engineers for that. And so they eventually worked around that, which I can get to, but it was a very ingenious way that that was taken care of. But at the time that the trustees had to make the decision, they eliminated that school, and we had a school of public health, and that was eliminated. But without going into too much detail, the plan was approved, and then the construction began. And as I mentioned last time, one of the major difficulties was that when the Great Depression hit, the university's enrollment went down. And so there was the anomaly of a plan for a big institution with new buildings and expanding enrollment, and instead the Depression had put us in the opposite direction. Dr. Johnson also had the idea that the university had to prove without any doubt that black people were competent in every field and could exercise leadership in every role. And therefore there was a conflict between that and what had been the university's tradition of having white and black leadership. And so as deans were retiring, a number of them were white deans, they were replaced by black deans. And there were some black Howard graduates who objected to that because they said, we have never been a Negro institution and you're making it one. Now, as it turned out, that was the only basis on which there was going to be major support. And even at that, many of the foundations refused to support the university's program because they believed it was too ambitious for the population the university served, and that it was far better to prepare people for industrial jobs and so on. So there was this controversial program. By the time the Second World War broke out, Howard's role as a leading institution was not only being acknowledged, but was being reinforced because the the university was asked to have accelerated programs in engineering so that our graduates could participate in the war effort, and the medical school had an accelerated program so that we could supply physicians for the war effort. And by 1940, the United States entered the war in 1941, but it was clear that war had already broken out in 1939, so it was clear that we were going to be involved. And the campus exploded in terms of how many people were here. And it was from that time forward that there was a race between getting resources and meeting the manpower needs of the country. And since the Army enterprise was so large, we were in double time to provide the trained personnel for that effort. And we had a larger enrollment than ever before and a greater impact. By that time, Dr. Johnson was acknowledged as an extraordinary leader, American university leader, and the internal opposition to him was largely diminished. And the rest of his time as president was one triumph after another. A number of the new people hired made outstanding records. The faculty was extraordinary. One winning a Nobel Prize in 1950, Dr. Ralph J. Bunch, who was the head of the political science department. And during the war, again, opportunities coming with the war, had worked in the State Department, and then later, of course, he went to the United Nations. And in all of the major departments, there were stars. And E. Franklin Frazier in sociology, and Rayford Logan in history, and Abram Harris in economics, and you could go down a long list of names that would be unfamiliar to many people now, but they were nationally known and internationally known. Dr. Johnson also became, in those years, a very strong voice against British, French, Dutch, and Belgian colonialism, and became a hero to many people in the colonies across the Caribbean and Africa. And of course, many of the students that were coming were international students, and many of them became leaders in their country after independence. And the number of international contacts was quite extraordinary for any American institution. And you can track that just by the photographs of honorary degree recipients and people who were speaking at Howard University. And among the most prominent was His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, who received an honorary degree. And of course, it was an extraordinary event. But there were others, such as President Radhakrishnan of India, and Prime Minister Nehru, and his sister, Madam Pandit, who was the Indian ambassador to the United Nations. And there are many people who are now surprised by the impact that Howard had at that time when they learn about it, because the State Department had learned that Howard University was a demonstration of what would be regarded as the most positive aspects of the United States. And as the Cold War began and the Soviet Union was projecting itself as a liberating country, the United States countered with the story of decolonization and African, Caribbean, and Indian students coming to Howard as part of the development of those nations. And there are a number of university publications at the time that reflected that. And the State Department began to use the university as an illustration of the improvements in American democracy, as it was put. So Dr. Johnson's administration from 1926 to 1960 was extraordinarily successful, though it was more difficult than most people could possibly imagine. And fortunately, the documentation is in the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center for much of that, including Dr. Johnson's speeches and his correspondence and so forth. Now, it's clear if one sees what the situation was in 1926 and what it was in 1960, that Dr. Johnson met the challenges that those years presented. His successor, Dr. James Madison Nabert, Jr., had a very different set of complexities he faced. The first one was the very length of Dr. Johnson's administration. It was 34 years. Any institution that has the same leader for 34 years can begin to get stiff in the joints, as it were, and not able to adapt to new circumstances. And this was true across the country. Nicholas Murray Butler, the president of Columbia University, stayed even longer, and it took Columbia a long time to recover from his success. And there was fear that Howard University would suffer some kind of breakdown once Dr. Johnson was not president, and he was so well known and so on and so forth. Now, Dr. Nabert had been at the university since 1936. He was 35 years old when he came, just a birthday that made it, he wasn't quite 36, to teach in the law school. And Dr. Johnson had recruited him personally. He was practicing law in Houston, Texas, and was very successful as an attorney representing black and American Indian families that had oil land and wildcatters who were white men who defrauded those families often of their property, and in many cases ran lines from their land into the black and Indian-owned land and siphoned off millions of dollars in oil. Dr. Johnson represented them. He represented criminal defendants. And while he was in Texas, he began litigating against the so-called white primary system. It took great courage to do that because such lawyers were shot all the time, just shot down on the street. But he did that. And Dr. Johnson went to see him. This is, again, unusual for the president of the university to go to try to recruit somebody. But that was that young man's reputation. And he had also known him at Morehouse College. Dr. Johnson had taught briefly at Morehouse, and Dr. Nabert was a student there. And of course, Dr. Johnson also knew Dr. Nabert's father, James Madison Nabert Sr., who was head of the Baptist Convention for the state of Georgia. I was a very prominent leader there. So he persuaded Dr. Nabert to come to Howard. And the reason that it wasn't difficult to persuade him, Dr. Nabert was at that point desperate to increase his effectiveness in civil rights law. But in Texas, even though he was a member of the Texas Bar, he could not use the bar library, and he could not use the University of Texas Law Library, since blacks were not admitted to either place. But he knew that if he came to Howard, he would have access to the law library at Howard University and the law library at the Library of Congress. And so he came to be a member of the faculty in 1936. And then in 1938, as fate would have it, the longtime secretary-treasurer of the university, Emmett J. Scott, retired as secretary because the position had been split so that there was a separate treasurer appointed. And Mr. Scott was a major enemy of Mordecai Johnson because Mr. Scott thought that he should have been president of Howard University. He was deeply involved in Republican politics, and he had the support of a group of men who wanted to get control of the Howard University payroll, and they were going to use it for political patronage. And Mr. Scott stayed on until his compulsory retirement in 1938, and then Dr. Johnson, at that relatively early age, became secretary of the Board of Trustees.
Dr. Nabert.
Yeah, Dr. Nabert became, at that age, he's still in his 30s, and it's hard to convey this. People use all sorts of interesting phrases to describe the kind of mind he had. Some people would say a mousetrap, some say razor sharp. None of that quite captures the way his mind worked. He was not only quick to grasp facts and arguments, but to see the picture comprehensively and then figure out what could be done about it. He wasn't a person who got fixated on ideal solutions or anything like that. This is a problem. What can we do about it now? And how can we lay a strategy to deal with it later? So he became secretary of the Board of Trustees, and of course then became intimately acquainted with the administration of the university, because we had a small administration in those days. There wasn't that much staff, and the institution was really run by there were no vice presidents. There was the president, the secretary of the university and the secretary of the Board of Trustees, and the treasurer, and a director of admissions, but it was a short list of people. And Dr. Nabert had that position, and he continued to teach law, and he continued to litigate. Now again, that is some indication of how effective a person he was. He's teaching law, and he is one of the top law professors. He is secretary of the university. He is secretary of the Board of Trustees. In short order, he also became director of public relations during the war, and had oversight of Veterans Affairs when the war was over. and he was involved in civil rights cases all across the United States. I don't know of anyone that played as many different roles simultaneously at Howard University as Dr. Nabrit. The law students worshiped him. Over and over again, he was regarded as the most effective teacher. He was speaking in the community. He was the ubiquitous person for a good while. And so in 1960, when Dr. Johnson retired, there was a great deal of speculation of who's going to be the president. And some people were talking about presidents at other institutions and so on and so forth. And the trustees decided that he would be a very effective transition president. Technically, that was what one thought of, because in 1960, the retirement age was, at that time, still 65. After he became president, it was increased to 68 for faculty and staff. But at the time, it was a fixed term. So this is the person who's going to solve certain kinds of problems that had accumulated. And because Dr. Johnson had slowed down by then, and he was carrying his years with great dignity, but you could tell that he was carrying them. My first 2 years as a student, he was president, and my last 2 years as an undergraduate, Dr. Nabrit was the president. And watching them, Dr. Nabrit was a youngish 60, and Dr. Johnson could easily give you the impression that he was more than 70. The exception was when he got on a platform, or when he got in a pulpit. He became younger when he started speaking. And this is an interesting phenomenon. It happens with great musicians. Pablo Casals was still performing internationally as a great cellist when he was in his 80s and even 90s. The same thing was true of many pianists, Claudio Arrau and others. I saw myself, some of them, almost creep across the Kennedy Center stage, but when they sat down at the piano, they suddenly became younger. They were in the element. And when Mordecai Johnson got in a pulpit or on a platform and got in the front of the lectern, cleared his throat a bit, and started speaking, the years dropped away. And so it was a very interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, Dr. Winston, I must comment here. What is striking is that Dr. Johnson received hundreds of invitations to speak, literally from around the world. And he had to reject most of it. Still, in any given year, he spoke at dozens of events around the United States and sometimes overseas. And even some may wonder, wow, when did he have time to achieve all this while giving speeches like that at that rate? That always fascinated me. And in addition to that, I'm sure I know you heard him speak.
Yeah.
And I just want you to comment on his skills as a speaker and all the invitations that he was receiving.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because in the first place, speaking around the United States in those days, air travel was rare, so you would be traveling by train, and of course you had to navigate the South. So you could not just get to a hotel because the hotels were not admitting Negroes. So arrangements had to be made with people who could properly house such a person. Again, it was a part of the way this was managed, so that, for example, in the case of college presidents, they would stop. They would usually stop at other colleges and be guests at that president's house because they wanted to have decent accommodations, and that was one of the ways that an extraordinary network of these black college presidents emerged, because they got to know each other because they depended on each other in that way. Dr. Johnson usually started off slowly. If it happened to be a sermon, usually there'd be a scriptural text, and he started off like a locomotive just starting. And then there would always be a point of drama where the conflict was laid out. And then there was some human capacity or special gift that entered the picture, and he could dramatize it. So that when one of his set subjects was Mahatma Gandhi, another was Abraham Lincoln. And he could imitate people. He could use different voices. And he was so much at home on a platform that he wouldn't stay in front of the lectern or behind the lectern and with a microphone. He didn't need a microphone. And he could walk. Sometimes he'd walk and talk. And then at a dramatic moment, he'd spin around and put out both fists. And as I say, it was perfect drama, and you did not forget his speeches. Now, Dr. John Warren Davis, who had been Dr. Johnson's roommate at Atlanta Baptist College and later president of West Virginia State College, told me, because he obviously knew Dr. Johnson very well, and I had asked him similar questions to the ones you're asking me, and he said, well, when you hear Mordecai, you're hearing and seeing three different people. He said, the first one you're seeing, he had a gesture like this as he got to the lectern and pulled his coat tight and then drew back even straighter than he usually was. He said, that is Professor Brawley. Professor Benjamin Brawley taught English at Atlanta Baptist College, then Morehouse, and was professor of English at Howard University at the end of his career. He said, now when you hear Mordecai and you see him lean across the lectern and whisper, he said, that's President Hope. When President Hope was going to make a really important point, he didn't shout, he did not raise his voice, he lowered it. Because when an audience sees a speaker lean forward as if he's telling you a secret and then lowers his voice, you are paying even more attention. And then he says, when the moment of drama comes, when he puts out both fists, and the fists would come out when he was talking about the colored peoples of the world, about the impoverished of the world, about the colonial subjects of the world, and he would talk about their rising, fists would come out. He said, now that gesture, you're looking at the person we call Big Boy at Atlanta Baptist College. That was Dean Archer, who was the dean of men. And Dr. Davis said to me, he said, Mr. Winston, because I was a Mr. at the time, he said, Mr. Winston, there were more faculty members than those 3 people, of course. But that was Morehouse College. President Hope, Dean Archer, and Professor Brawley, because they were the ones who transformed young men's lives. Everybody else was a helper in that process, but they gave the college the character it had, and they drew things out of young men. He said, I remember walking across the campus of Atlanta University, and Dr. Du Bois and Mr. Hope were walking side by side. And Dr. Du Bois said, Hope, they were very good friends. Hope, how do you take these rough boys from the country and make gentlemen of them and real thinkers? How do you do that? And Mr. Hope said to Dr. Du Bois, Du Bois, if Brawley or Archer or I stood in the way of these boys, he said, they come from the country in those rough conditions, being mistreated by white people, and they come here hungry for knowledge and opportunity. And if we stood in their way, they would roll right over us, because that's what they're after. And all we have done is harness that eagerness, and then it becomes the engine for their success. It's their own ambition. But when they first come here, they don't look very promising. Now, that was a theme of Dr. Johnson's that he carried for his entire professional career and being president. Ordinary people, what he used to call humble people, with effort, guidance, and resources could become great. And he always spoke to the freshmen when they came and told them that you can become great at Howard University. He said, when we assemble at the formal opening of the university and Charter Day, we should take our shoes off when we enter the chapel. All convocations were in the chapel except commencement, which was outdoors. He said, we should take our shoes off. I heard him say this myself. Because we're standing on holy ground. Because the people who were slaves, who were the children of slaves, the people who have come from some of the poorest places in the earth, they have come here to this place, sat in these classrooms, and they have become great people and provided service to the world. He said, that's what makes this place holy. He said, now, if I said that every day, people would think I was crazy. But if you will sit there in those seats and think about what happens at Howard University, and people coming from all over the world who have had very little in their lives to encourage them and to overcome a system. He always talked about the system. That's not new talk. Systemic racism would be nothing new. It's just the terminology is a little different. But he understood this was a system. And it was necessary to do some extraordinary things to overcome it. Now, if you hear me talk about him in that way, and then talk about the opposition he faced, it's a puzzle at first. It certainly was a puzzle to me. And then I began to understand it, because one Sunday in chapel, I heard him talk about the role of a president. And he said, you know, in a university you have all of these gifted people with great talents and the best training available in the world. And it's like a great orchestra. He says, you know, you have all these fine musicians in an orchestra. And they're very often the best in their field on their particular instrument. But they're no good without a conductor. It's the conductor who makes the orchestra great. And it was at that moment I realized Dr. Johnson thought of himself as the conductor. All of this talent that he was going to wave the baton and have all of these gifted people make a unified, beautiful sound. And that's where the charge of dictatorship came from. And of course, the faculty resented it. Because for many of them, particularly those in the social science division, which was the pit of the opposition, they said that man pretends that he knows more economics than the economists and more sociology than the sociologists, and so, because he talks about all of these things with great authority, and he hasn't read the latest article on this, that, the other, and he should not interfere with our academic programs, and so on and so forth. And as I say, I had thought about these things for a good while, and then I realized, it is a misapplication of the metaphor. No president of any university can have the control that a conductor has over a great orchestra. That's not part of the bargain. The bargain in universities is you hire the most competent people you can. They are operating within the constraints of a curriculum and whatever the rules of the university are. But otherwise, they are free agents. They can say what they want to say, teach how they want to teach. And he was a great believer in academic freedom, but he still had that conductor image in his mind. And that helped me understand why some of the greatest faculty we ever had could not stand Mordecai Johnson. Others who were a little more experienced or understanding or had different kinds of personalities understood it, but not many did. And it was part of the tragedy of building something great, expecting to control it for the benefit of the institution and all of that. He wasn't self-interested or petty in that way. But it created multiple collisions. Now, Dr. Nabert was a different sort of person altogether. If you saw Dr. Johnson striding across the campus, he looked like a great statesman from Edwardian England. He looked like he was the Prime Minister of England walking across the campus. The president's house was where the undergraduate library is now. And he strode across the campus. He wore a Homburg, always tipped it to the female students and faculty. Many of the women faculty, and we only had one female dean, Dean Ina Bell Lindsay of the School of Social Work, and he would call them daughter. Now, he was older than all of them, but he called female students very often daughter, and then some women faculty and so forth, and that didn't go over very well. But when you saw him striding across the campus. You didn't have to know his name. You could be a stranger on the campus and you say, that's the man in charge walking there. Dr. Neighbor, completely different. You could see him walking across the campus and he's talking to everybody. He's come into a room, put his hand out. How are you doing today? How are you doing? He was easy to meet, had a smile. You'd never imagine the tough situations he had been in, because once he had dealt with that, he was, as he used to call himself, Jim Neighbor. Hi, how you doing? I'm Jim Neighbor. The styles are very different. And he opened his administration with an eagerness to have new people in new situations. And at his first charter day in the spring of March of 1961, he did something unprecedented. We wanted to set a new tone. Instead of having some international figure or national figure in the United States to speak, he had a faculty member and a student speak for the first time at Charter Day. And much to my surprise, I was the student speaker. Now again, how Dr. Neighbor knew about Michael Winston, I do not know. To this day, I have no idea, but he asked me to be the student speaker, and
was that before or after the debate between Malcolm X?
This was in my junior year. The debate with Malcolm X was senior year.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I am confident I was elected president of the student council on the basis of what I said at Charter Day, because everyone heard it. The whole camp. This was Dr. Neighbor's first Charter Day. Alumni were there. Every faculty member, who could get there. It was quite an event, and it was the first Charter Day in Crampton Auditorium. So it was not in the chapel. It was a much bigger event. And Professor Lucas was a very young professor of urology, and he spoke as a faculty member. Neither one of us had any formal constituency, because I was not president of the student council. I was not an elected student leader. But somehow he had identified me. And as a matter of fact, he did not ask me directly. I received a call saying that the dean of the university, as his title was then, Dr. William Stewart Nelson, wanted to see me in his office, which I could not imagine. Why does Dr. Nelson want to see me? He was one of the senior administrators, and he had been dean of the School of Religion, but he was internationally known as a great figure. And I went to his office on the 4th floor of the administration building. I think that may have been the first time I was on the 4th floor of the administration building. And went into his very quiet office. As soon as you entered his offices, everything was quiet. Dr. Nelson was soft-spoken but authoritative, and he said very calmly, Mr. Winston, President Neighbor has decided that he would like you to speak at the Charter Day. So I had the wit to ask him right on the spot there. I said, Dr. Nelson, will my speech be reviewed? Will the text be reviewed or censored? He said, oh, of course not, Mr. Winston, of course not. So no one knew what I was going to say. And I wrestled with it. And I turned that speech into a speech about certain grievances that students had. I had not talked with anyone about it. I was concerned that the student body was not being paid attention to, that we had a number of faculty who came and left rather quickly and did not spend any time with students to speak of. And I also addressed an issue that I think very few of the faculty or the other people in the audience imagined I would talk about. There had been in the New Republic and some other publications editorials on what they called the new possibilities for Howard University. And they argued that now that we are in an era of desegregation, Howard University has succeeded in its original mission, and now Howard University needs to become the university that the United States has for the education of foreign students. And because the Soviet Union had started programs, and they had later what was called Lumumba University, and this would be the United States' Lumumba University, although I don't think the Lumumba University had yet been named. And I said, despite the palpable signs, I still remember the phrase, that segregation is crumbling, Howard University has not completed its mission, and its mission is not narrowly defined. And so we should continue what we're doing, but on a larger scale to include more people. And it was obvious that people were startled that a student had understood the policy implications of what these editorials were doing. They were trying to manipulate the university because we were dependent on a federal appropriation. And this was supposed to be a new justification, as if the problems involving racism had been solved, which was an illusion, and we would be in a trap. So I got that off my chest. And there was stunned silence at first, but then there was quite a lot of applause. People were surprised, and Professor Lucas was a bit thrown off. He said, the student has stolen my thunder. He said, I had a few things to say from a faculty point of view, but I want to say that I had some great professors here. Now, of course, I wasn't saying that the professors weren't great. We had some great ones, but we also had more and more who were passing through here. And I was also reacting to what I regarded as a depreciation of the classroom experience. And I also saw that the move to more graduate programs could easily become one where the undergraduate programs were suffering in order to mount more PhD programs. So that was out. But in any event, Dr. Nabrit set a new tone and began to appoint people to significant positions that were younger and conspicuously different from many of the more old-fashioned people that we had, because there wasn't great turnover at Howard in terms of faculty or staff. Many had been hired in the 1930s and were still there then, at the beginning of the 1960s, and were older. And so he came up with some new people. And one of them was Patricia Roberts Harris. In that period, well, actually it was 2 years earlier, Dr. Sadie Yancey was Dean of Women, and she died prematurely. And then there was an interim, and then Dr. Nabert appointed Mrs. Harris. Now, what was unusual about that? In the first place, she was a lawyer. She was very outspoken. She was conspicuously young. And such people had not been Dean of Women. And she came, she taught torts on the law faculty, and of course she was later, for a brief time, Dean of the law school. But she was a breath of fresh air and was a great inspiration to many of the young women on the campus, because she was encouraging them to participate in public affairs and encourage them to become lawyers. My wife was one of those students, encouraged by her. The former mayor of the District of Columbia, Sharon Pratt, was another young student who saw her, and I want to become a lawyer like her too. And so you got a sense of change. And when he was inaugurated, the April following Charter Day, there was real enthusiasm about this new president. And I am convinced that had it not been for the intervention of President Lyndon Johnson, Dr. Nabert's last years at the university would have been entirely different. The problem came up when President Johnson asked Secretary of Labor he was at that time, Arthur Goldberg had been a labor lawyer. He was on the Supreme Court by that time. President Johnson wanted his friend Abe Portis to go to take that seat. So Johnson asked Arthur Goldberg to go to the United Nations as ambassador to the United Nations. Arthur Goldberg said to President Johnson, I want Jim Nabert of Howard to be my deputy, and I'll go on that condition. Now, why was that the case? The two of them had been involved in labor matters. Dr. Nabert attended the meeting of the International Labor Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, on an annual basis, and got to know Goldberg very well in that connection. And Goldberg could see how effective he was in dealing with people and issues. And at the UN, a big problem for many of the United States ambassadors to the UN in those days was the significant number of new countries, so-called, being at the UN And many of the senior white officials were a bit uncertain as to how to deal with those people, which would seem counterintuitive. But anyway, Dr. Nabert was supposed to help the American delegation deal with that. Dr. Nabert did not want to do it. And at one point, President Johnson was tired of waiting for an answer and called Dr. Nabert. Dr. Nabert was in Hawaii at the time on vacation. The President of the United States tracked him down and called him and said, I need you to go to New York. And Dr. Nabert said, well, I have to, get something worked out with the trustees. And this was typical Lyndon Johnson. Now, do I need to call your trustees? Dr. Nabert said, no, I'll talk to them. So he was trapped. He had to leave. Now, things were going well. Dr. Nabert did go to the UN. He did not resign as president. He took leave because he wanted to come back from the United Nations and preside at the centennial of the university. This was going to be a big moment, and Dr. Nabert wanted to use the centennial as an opportunity to reposition the university and also to present the record of the university, which is another matter that relates to Dr. Logan's history of Howard, which is another story, but it is very much related. So as it happened, I had come back to the university and was an instructor in history in the history department. And so I saw this transition. Dr. Nabert was going to be on leave, and Dr. Stanton L. Wormley, who was what was then called the academic vice president, later title changed to vice president of academic affairs. And he was the first such and was the only vice president at the time. The other vice presidencies were added by Dr. Cheek. And the contrast in personalities and way of dealing with people could not have been more different between Dr. Wormley and Dr. Nabert. Dr. Nabert was gregarious and outgoing, and Dr. Wormley was taciturn, quiet. I think he was shy, but most people took that as arrogance and so on and so on. He had been head of the German department, and he did not communicate well with people. Now, as it happens, he was acting president when the student demonstrations began. And those picked up in tempo. Some matters that Dr. Nabert would have taken care of, dealt with one way or another rather quickly, simply festered. And the university became known for campus turmoil. Students were up in arms about various things, the war, the student movement, and the campus had also become quite overcrowded. Because one of the things Dr. Nabert did right away was to increase admissions. And I saw what the impact of that was on the teaching end, because classes were crowded, general education courses were oversubscribed and it took forever to get registered. We simply had too many students for the capacity we had. And we had a requirement that first-year female students live in the dormitory, but we admitted more people than could be in the dormitory rooms, so there were students sleeping on cots in hallways and so on. Now, Dr. Nabrit's intent was to say to the Congress, our programs are now in such high demand that we are overcrowded, and we need some more facilities to accommodate them. That is typical state university tactic, that you increase your budget by increasing your enrollment. Except that in this case it backfired, because there was student discontent unrelated to teaching, unrelated to the dining hall food, any of the things that very often get a campus moving in the wrong direction. So when Dr. Nabrit finally returned from the United Nations, the campus was in turmoil. What the image of the University of California at Berkeley was nationally, that was the image at Howard University. What is the demonstration of the day going to be? And there were TV cameras on the campus regularly, on the 6 o'clock news and so on and so forth. And Columbia University in New York was hit with a similar kind of situation, where some circumstances that had festered over time blew up, and Columbia was in trouble. So we were not alone by any means, but we had a very precarious situation. And as you know, in the spring of 1968, students took over the administration building, and Dr. Nabrit was regarded as a failed president. Some people were foolish enough to call him an Uncle Tom, and he had been a hero of the civil rights movement. And as nervy and brave as such a person could be, but he had suddenly become a symbol of the old order, and he had been anything but until he went to the UN. And that, as it happened, was the occasion for my return to the university from the University of California at Berkeley. I was on my way to Vienna to work at the Imperial Archives, the Haushof and Staatsarchiv, on my dissertation. My wife and I literally had boxes in the living room ready to move, and because I had gotten the fellowship to take care of that. And then I got this unexpected call from Dr. Nabrit saying, I need you to come back to Howard. I said to him, Dr. Nabrit, I can't do that because I'm on my way to Austria to work on my dissertation. He said, well, everybody says you love Howard University. You can't delay this because there may not. We are in a very difficult situation, and I need you to come back. And then he said something that shocked me. He said, I need you to be Assistant Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. Now, Mr. Abebe, I did not have a PhD. I had never had any kind of administrative experience at the university. I had some outside of the university, but never at the university. A substantial part of the faculty had been teachers of mine. They had seen me as a teenager, and then I'm going to be in some kind of role as assistant dean of the college, and I'm 27 years old. But he was a great advocate, as you know, and what he could do in a courtroom, he could do in a telephone conversation. And by the time I hung up, I had agreed to become assistant dean of the college. And when I came back in the summer of 1968. I was coming back to a place I did not recognize, literally. The students did not look like Howard University students to me. They were in dashikis. They had afros out to here. Many of them had renamed themselves. They now had African names. They were talking about we needed to get rid of the name Howard University because he was a white man. And some were talking about a Malcolm X University. Some were talking about a Sterling Brown University, and so on and so forth. And there was a hostility that was pretty mutual between faculty and students, because many of the students thought these faculty people are from ancient times. They don't know what we're talking about, and they're not relevant, and so on. And we need new courses, and the university needs to be remade, and so on and so on. Some of my words of Charter Day 1961 coming back to haunt me, okay, in a different form, but there it was. And so Dr. Nabrett had agreed, because people were talking about get rid of Nabrett and so on. The Washington Post was writing editorials like that. And he agreed to give the trustees the year, because he was scheduled to retire anyway, to meet the retirement requirement in July 1969. So they would have this year. And it was a terrible year because things continued to fall apart. Now, all of that to say that Dr. Nabrett's last years at the university were most unfortunate, though his presidency had started out on a very high note. And he left at a time of national turmoil. You really do have to look at it in the context of the time. And that was the background for the third president you asked about, Dr. James Edward Cheek. Now, there was a very odd thing that had happened. Though the trustees had been given more than a year's notice to find a successor, they hadn't been able to do that. They apparently came to a conclusion that the person they would ask to be president was Andrew Brimmer, an economist who was on the Federal Reserve, and he would be the president. As in earlier cases, they hadn't imagined that he might say no. How could anyone say no to an offer to become president of Howard? Well, they hadn't apparently been paying attention in the 2 years of upheaval, because it was obvious a very, very hot seat. Apparently they asked Dr. Brimmer fairly early on, and he said he needed time to decide. And then in the spring of 1969, he told them that he would not accept the offer. And they were suddenly in very bad trouble, because it was absolutely clear Dr. Nabrett was leaving. And many of us thought he would not live out that year, literally, because of the amount of pressure he was under, and you could see how he was not looking like himself. He lived to be in his mid-90s, but he didn't look like he was headed in that direction at that time. And then this unusual circumstance. One of the members of the board was Asa T. Spaulding of Durham, North Carolina, and had been president of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company and had been a member of the Board of Trustees at Howard for a long time. And he was simultaneously the chairman of the board of Shaw University. And he said, I think I have the right man that I have identified. And James E. Cheek, Dr. Cheek, has done a remarkable job at Shaw, and the institution was in very serious financial trouble and unrest on the campus, and he was able to settle all of that and has come up with new programs and has now attracted foundation help, and there's even going to be a Shaw University in Detroit because he's going to have multiple campuses. Shaw will be in major cities where the populations are, and we will be prospering. So some members of the board went to Raleigh to talk to Dr. Cheek. He did not accept the position. And he told me once, he said, the next morning I was shaving and I usually had the radio on. He was a great fan of radio. That's why we have a radio station here. He believed in it as a medium as well as television. He had the radio on, and it was announced that Dr. James Cheek is the new president of Howard University. They had just done it. And he was shocked. And the camp.
After he said no.
Right. After he said no. And the campus was unprepared. So I was, as I mentioned, assistant dean of the College of Liberal Arts. I went to the president's reception for graduating seniors, which was held in the lower lounge of Crampton Auditorium. So as I was walking, and that was always a black tie affair, the people, the receiving line, everybody was in tuxedos and so forth. So I was appropriately dressed and had come over from Lock Hall to go to Crampton. And as I got to 6th Street, I saw the president's car pull up. Dr. Nabrit stepped out and took his wife's hand, and he saw me, and he said, "Hey, Mike, take Norma to the reception for me." He was in a summer straw hat and a light-colored suit. It was obvious he was not going to his own reception for graduating seniors, because he and the trustees had fallen out totally. And I will, in a moment, tell that story because it's quite extraordinary. But anyway, I walked over with my best Hollywood nerves, extended my arm to Mrs. Nabrit, and she said, "Hello, Mr. Winston, it's so very nice to see you." This was all as if nothing unusual was going on. And then I walked into Crampton Auditorium and then the lobby, and then going downstairs to the ground level. And there all of the deans lined up, and university officers, and here comes Michael Winston with the president's wife on his arm, and I walk her down and escort her to the head of the line, and I noticed that there's something strange in the atmosphere. It all looked like people standing around in a funeral home, you know. And so I got myself disappeared as quickly as possible and went over to see Colonel James Robinson, who was administrative assistant to the acting president. Had been then, but he was, Colonel Robinson was regarded as one of the best administrators at the university. And I said, Colonel, what's going on? He said, well, they've just announced the name of the new president, and nobody knows who he is. Some preacher named Cheek. I said, you mean Dr. James Cheek? He said, yes, you know about him? I said, well, he's very well known in higher education, and he has attracted all sorts of resources to Shaw University. But this was because they had not been prepared, they had not been told, they didn't know anything about Dr. Cheek. He was just some man named Cheek, some preacher named Cheek, was now going to be the president of Howard University. And I thought to myself, oh, this is going to be awful, because he will not be well received since there's been no preparation for it. And as typical of Howard University, they're not sure that anybody can be a successful president of Howard University, especially someone they don't know. And as I had anticipated, when Dr. Cheek arrived, to call the atmosphere chilly would be a great understatement. And he had his doubts, because he used to tell me about the first time he went into the cafeteria. He said, these people around here don't speak to anyone, and I'm president of the university, and they're acting in a very strange way, and so on and so on. And I had to be some kind of improvisational intermediary, because I understood why he was put off and the university was not prepared for him. Now, one factor that is hardly known these days as to why the atmosphere was so tense. There came a time, the chairman of the board at the time was Judge Scoville Richardson. And he was a very interesting fellow. There came a time when there was a campus demonstration, and students were, this was 1969, but this is after the 68 takeover of the building. And the students had taken over Douglas Hall, and we had a very bad situation. The 82nd Airborne Division had been called to go over to Banneker Field, and students were barricaded in various buildings. The university had gotten a temporary restraining order, and the students were in violation of the order. And the press was on the campus, lights and so forth. Neighborhood kids had come onto the campus, and Tempo B, a temporary building that was built during World War II and had been at one time the temporary housing for the School of Music, it had been used a lot, was on fire. The fire department couldn't get through the gates because they were blocked by neighborhood kids and just dense people coming to see what's going on at Howard University. And President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, had called the mayor's office and said, we are not going to have a spectacle again at Howard University. And if I have to restore order, I will. And so that's why he called in the military. And I was on the campus, this was at night. I was the only person from the dean's office there. Everybody else had gone home. And the expectation was that the military would storm the campus. And we knew about storming of campuses that had happened at South Carolina State, and students had been shot down at Kent State in Ohio. And then there was this individual, Howard graduate, who saved the situation. The students were in violation of a court order. The court order had to be enforced by the Marshal of the District of Columbia. The Marshal of the District of Columbia at that time was a graduate of the Howard Law School and an adjunct professor in the Howard Law School. He was a 6-foot-plus man who was the first black person since Frederick Douglass to be the Marshal of the District of Columbia. His name was Luke C. Moore. He later became a judge of the Superior Court. And the general in charge said that he was going to move on the campus. The marshal stood up very straight. I saw this with my own eyes. And he said, I am the Marshal of the District of Columbia, and I am responsible for the enforcement of the temporary restraining order of the court. And we will not have tonight a conflict between the military and the civilian authorities of the District of Columbia. And Marshal Moore would not move. So now all of these kids who were spectators and so on, and we've had by that time 2 fires on the campus. You could see the flames. Tempo B burned down to the ground. He didn't move. And then, after all of the kids were out of the way, he and his force went into Douglas Hall, broke down the door, and dragged the students out and took them to jail. And there was no shooting, and the campus was fine. Every time I saw Mr. Moore after that time, I called him Cool Hand Luke, because he had nerves of steel. He loved this place, and he wasn't going to have it torn up by some other law enforcement or military, and he wasn't going to have the students just have their way. And there's a school in Washington now named for him. But that was that background. And Dr. Cheek coming after all of that turmoil, then this, well, again, the reason that night is significant in other ways, the chairman of the Board of Trustees had told Dr. Nabrit that he needed to call the police. This was before the situation with Luke Moore. It was the same general incident, but. And Dr. Nabrit looked at all the trustees and the chairman and said, the moment you call police on Howard University students is the moment I will resign as president of Howard University. And chairman of the board looked around at his colleagues and said, "He's defying the board of trustees." Dr. Neighbor said, "I'm doing no such thing. I'm just telling you what will happen if you call police on demonstrating students at Howard University. I will not be president of that." So, all of the escalation and the fires and all that's going on. And it was very serious because there were some non-Howard students involved in those disorders. How do I know? I went over to Founders Library and saw people I knew were not Howard students had gasoline cans. They put these cans of gasoline on every floor of the stacks. They would go burn the building down. And there was a liberal arts student who fought with them. He got into a fist fight with some of those people, found some chains and chained the front doors of what was then the Moorland room, because one of these characters was saying, "This is Negro history in here, we're going to burn it down, and then we're creating black history." And he chained the doors, and they couldn't get in. It was rumored that, I don't know this for a fact, that these were some people sent from Texas who were getting revenge against James Neighbor. Okay? So the whole thing will be burned down. And of course, then students would be pinned with, these people are so savage that they burned down their own university. The perfect storyline for the opposition. And as I say, I am not a conspiracy theorist, so I don't know. But I know the people I saw were not Howard students. And I knew plenty of the so-called radicals. I taught them in my class because one of the things I said to the dean when I came as assistant dean, I said, "Dean, I'm going to need to teach." He said, "You don't have time to teach." I said, "I need to teach because we have a student problem, and you cannot deal with student problems unless you know the students, and I don't know these students. And I want to get to know the so-called radicals, the people who call themselves revolutionaries." And he said, "So what is your course that you're going to teach?" I said, "It's going to be called Modern Revolutions and Liberation Movements." He said, "What? We're dealing with all of this disorder and you're going to be teaching revolutions?" I said, "Mr. Dean," the dean was Vincent J. Brown, professor of government, and he'd become dean, appointed by Dr. Neighbor. He had been assistant to Dr. Neighbor for some years. I said, "I don't think these students know what a revolution is. And they need to know because they're getting ready to be in the deepest trouble of their lives, and they will not, it would just be all because of mouth and not substance." So I had a syllabus about this thick. We studied the English Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. And I also covered the American War of Independence, which I refused to call a revolution because it didn't have the characteristics of a revolution. You don't have a revolution and still have slavery. You don't have a revolution that doesn't disturb the economic system at all, okay? So anyway. And when I went to my first class, many of the leaders of the, quote, revolution were sitting in the front row, dressed in dashikis, One of them sported the name Jomo. First day of class, he says, "What makes you think you know something about revolutions? Were you in a revolution?" I said, "Well, you have raised a very important epistemological question. How do we know about anything? Must we participate in something to know about it? And does that mean knowing implies understanding?" I said, we're going to be studying these different revolutions to understand what the dynamics of revolutions would be. What is the experience of humanity with revolutions? How is a revolution different from a revolt or a riot? And is what we have going on as civil disorder the equivalent of revolution? Well, after a number of them took a look at the syllabus, they vanished because it was going to be a serious effort. But the result was I got to know the students who, some of them had taken over the administration buildings, some of them had been involved in some very difficult things. But I made students out of them, and many of them became important contributors to the university. But that period was brutal. And Dr. Cheek's reception coming in the middle of that, even now, all these years later, I cannot pretend I fully understand how Dr. Cheek got through those early years of his presidency, because he was not deterred. He focused on resources. As I mentioned, I think in the first interview, he asked the Congress for double Dr. Nabrit's largest budget. He did not get it. He did not get a dime more the first year. Second year, he did get it. And that's when we went from 10 schools to 17 with new programs. That's when he created the School of Communications and went after a radio station and a TV station, and he wanted a university press, which he was able to build, even though most people at the university did not know what a university press was. Most of the trustees thought that was a printing plant. But anyway, he was a man of vision, just as Dr. Johnson was and just as Dr. Nabrit was. Now, they had different visions, of course. Dr. Nabrit's was for a desegregated society and for democracy to really be democracy. He was clear about that. Dr. Cheek knew a great deal about higher education, and he projected what he called a university of the first rank and a black university of the first rank. Now, he was not carried away with the idea that what people were calling integration was going to be the salvation of the race. He didn't believe it. He said we need to develop our own base of excellence. This is a resource. He liked the word resource. And this is an international and national resource for our people. Now, presidents of Howard hadn't talked like that before. Even though Dr. Johnson talked about the black peoples of the world, the colored peoples of the world, and so on, he had a very nuanced view, and he was also skeptical of what some people meant by integration, because he gave a remarkable speech in Rankin Chapel about desegregation and the future of Negro organizations. And his example was the National Medical Association, the National Dental Association, the National Bar Association. He said, now we have been excluded from the American Bar Association on racial grounds, the American Medical Association, and the American Dental Association on racial grounds. We need to become members of those, but we also need to stay members of the National Medical Association. We still will need our institutions and organizations as resources. Now, what was he talking about? The largest Negro organization in the United States had been the American Teachers Association. Some people think, oh, NAACP must have been. No. These were school teachers all over the South who were black school teachers. And Dr. John W. Davis was one of the leaders of the ATA. And Dr. Davis, who, when he retired from West Virginia State, worked for the Legal Defense Fund in New York, said, now it's our job to be statesmen, and so we will need to exercise leadership. So the American Teachers Association should merge with the National Education Association. And then we will have integrated all of these teachers, and they will communicate, and that will make school integration possible because the teachers will know each other. And so it came about that the ATA merged with the NEA, and there was one person from the ATA who became a vice president of the NEA, and the ATA vanished. Now that used to be a huge meeting where people were mobilized to do all sorts of things, and it provided a basis for solidarity. And there were people who had the same view about Howard University and what we now call HBCUs. They said, we need to be statesmen and work ourselves out of a job because this is going to be the new America. Well, as it turned out, Dr. Johnson's middle view turned out to be very optimistic. Dr. Cheek's pessimistic view about how we were going to be received turned out to be more accurate than many of us thought. And the fact that Howard University not only survived that, but then prospered, points to the importance of Howard University nationally and internationally, and the importance of its success. Because many people will say certain things can't be done, and then all you have to do is say it's been done at Howard. So if you're talking about people who are neurosurgeons or people, orthopedic surgeons or whatever, we've got them. You talk about cancer research, it's being done right at Howard University. Taking students who have been severely disadvantaged and providing opportunity and transforming them into successful people, it's done. So those three presidencies are very important prisms through which you view the changing prospects in American society.
Coming back to Moorland-Spingarn, what, in your opinion, and as the founding director, which collection or collections were the most interesting and the most difficult to acquire?
I would say this, that consistent with the times when the Research Center was organized, the plans were very ambitious. And as time went on, it became clear that the university would not get access to the resources on which some of those plans had been predicated. Now, what was originally laid out by me was that much of the material in the research center would become more widely available through various forms of publication. Nowadays, it's possible to digitize a good bit of the material, and where that's possible legally and otherwise, I would think that'd be very important in terms of access and getting the materials used. I had said that there had to be multiple steps beyond being a very carefully taken care of warehouse for rare documents and rare materials. The purpose of these documents, after all, is not to just have them and treasure them, but to make them an integral part of the world's knowledge. And now digitization makes that possible. I also thought that since I knew that Dr. Cheek was going to build a university press, that there would be cooperative projects between the research center and the university press. And Dr. Thomas C. Battle, my immediate successor, did have the beginning of a series, the Moorland-Spingarn series, and at least 2 publications came out of that. There was also the expectation that there would be synergy between the research center and the new electronic resources of the university, the radio station and the television station. Because there are audio recordings there, still reel-to-reel documentaries. Much can be accomplished on the basis of documentary series. As long ago as Dr. Carter G. Woodson's time, the association that he headed published series of documents. One of them became very widely used, and that was The Mind of the Negro as Reflected in Letters. And some of the rarest letters were presented, introduced, and edited by Dr. Woodson. There are large individual collections that have letters, journals, diaries in them that should be made known to scholars, and then of course you would need to have scholars do them. I'm not thinking of all of this being done by staff, but the appropriate scholars matched up with these rich resources. The same thing is true of the prints and photographs resources. That's why I created the Prints and Photographs Department. Just this past week, I went through a book called Un-American, and it is a book of photographs with very little commentaries, just the photographs, about the incarceration of Japanese American citizens. There were 109,000 persons of Japanese descent sent to concentration camps, I would call them. They were not death camps, as certain, like Auschwitz and Treblinka, but Germany had many concentration camps that were not death camps, like Theresienstadt and others. Well, just looking through this book of photographs, one has an immediate sense of how President Roosevelt's executive order to put those people in concentration camps as far away as Arkansas and in Arizona and California and so forth, what that experience was like. And the photographers were government photographers that were used. including Dorothea Lange, one of the great documentary photographers. Well, we have a number of photo collections that document without a lot of text what the experience has been. And the correspondence between various individuals give you an insight that is in many ways more important than a historian's opinion. We have correspondence and diaries of people who were involved in every major movement. And we have not adequately documented the faculty of Howard University. One of the things I wanted to do was establish an archive of Howard University faculty. Their official work, their academic work, as well as, in some cases where it's appropriate, they're documenting them personally. And that would involve having them interviewed as they are approaching retirement or are retired, collecting photographs. Many of them have personal collections that are extraordinarily valuable for research and documentation projects. And I can tell you from my personal experience, when you move out of a house that you've been in for years, and in our case it was 46 years in the same place, and move to an apartment, you cannot take all that you have collected. So in my case, as you know, all the correspondence and files, teaching files, correspondence with all the organizations I worked with and so on, are at Moorland-Spingarn. But when you look at the faculty at large and the role they played in their disciplines, having such a collection documents the university's accomplishments. And we have not had at Howard something that a number of universities do, and that is when a faculty member of long years service retires, there is what's called a memorial. This is while they're living, that is written by a committee from their department. But this is who the person is, this is when they came to this institution, and this is what they've accomplished. And these are the programs or publications or whatever that they started. And they're also photographs, so that nothing like that exists for the great teachers I had at Howard University, but they're online for the teachers I had at the University of California. And that's a very large faculty. But that is done, the same thing is done at Harvard and Yale. We allow our faculty to disappear, and they shouldn't. If, for example, that had been done in the case of someone like Dr. W. Montague Cobb, who is now world famous, he was well known then, he wasn't the case that he was unknown, but to have his photographs, we have in a laboratory his collection of skeletons, and that has turned out to be a very important thing. But we did not get the resources to document things at the community level. Because the last interview I mentioned our connections with various community groups and community organizations. Because the center has something no other part of the university has, and that is connections with the full spectrum of the Black experience. From so-called ordinary people, in my experiences, there's no such thing as ordinary people. You have people who are better known than others, people who do amazing things for their community where they are. And then we have people in academic and professional enterprises, And that needs to be documented because, again, our whole conception of the so-called making of history has changed. Once upon a time, there was a so-called great man theory of history. So if you want to understand what happened in history, you study some of these important figures. So if you want to know what happened in France between such and such a date, you study Napoleon. Well, when you study Napoleon, you'll know about Napoleon. But you won't know as much about France as you ought to know. And if you want to know about black Americans, you need to know more than just Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, or whatever list of names that you produce. Because it's the people who make the history. But there has to be a basis for documenting that so it can become knowledge. And the people who write diaries and letters and so on are people of a certain sort. So you know about them, but that doesn't tell you about that larger experience. So for example, one of the great resources for understanding the transition from slavery to freedom are the interviews done with former slaves by the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression, because they were interviewed. And we have that. John W. Blassingame, who was first on this faculty and then went to Yale and was a colleague of mine in the history department. John Blassingame did a large book published by Louisiana State University Press called Slave Testimony. That book could just as easily have been published by the Howard University Press because those are public documents in the National Archives, and John had the insight to see this needs to be made available. We have connections in various places that would give us access to various freedom movements around the world where the material is available, and we have resources to preserve that that's not available in those home countries. So I have a sense of the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center as an asset for humanity to get mobilized knowledge so that we can act on it to improve the lives of people. I'm an academic. I will always be an academic, but I care about more people than just academics. And consistent with the history of Howard University, our attention needs to be very broad and to pay attention to people that most universities don't pay attention to. There should be no town gown hostility or distance as there are in other institutions. But we have not opened our resources as much as we might to local communities. I'll give a single example. It's very simple. This is one person, Dr. Warren Ash, who was one of the staff deans at the medical school, had been a Boy Scout. And he came to see me. He had discovered somehow that I had been a Boy Scout. And he said, Dr. Winston, I want you to get involved in the community to help me make available to people in LaDroit Park and other places in Washington and low-income areas what scouting can do. And he started an explorer troop right in the neighborhood of the medical school. And one part of their activities was to become volunteers in the hospital. And a number of those Boy Scouts from the local neighborhood got interested in medicine as a result of that. It was no longer a mystery building that they were never supposed to go near and so on. They knew people in there. and they eventually were medical students themselves. I don't think more than 5 or 6 people in the whole university knew about Dean Ash's program. I had never heard of it. I didn't know he was a Boy Scout. And to this day, I don't know how he found out that I was one in New York, but he got me involved with the board of the Boy Scouts. And I was dealing with all of these community efforts. Now, my great weakness was I tried to do too much. And some of it went fine for a while, but I never succeeded in getting enough of what I would call synergy, where there were people carrying that on. Now, the Research Center is the most significant accomplishment I ever had at Howard University. And one indication of that to me that I'm very satisfied with is that we trained a whole cadre of manuscript librarians, research librarians, rare book people, and they became employed by the Library of Congress, the National Archives, other institutions. That has not been continued. Now, we didn't have any special grant to do that. We just knew that there are far too few black archivists and manuscript people, and they just need to have the opportunity. And Moorland-Spingarn was more active in the Society of American Archivists than any other institution. And Karen Jefferson and others became major figures. So I see an effect that is similar to what economists call the multiplier effect, where our own staff members can multiply the influence of the center and the university by doing constructive things. And it doesn't have to be in the newspaper and popular and everybody knows about it. We're not celebrities, but we can move the needle of history.
Thank you, Dr. Winston. I know we're running out of time. Quickly,
Okay. Should
should we expect another Howard history or an autobiography from you?
No, in the first place, academic autobiographies are not very interesting. All right? What may be of interest are in the Michael R. Winston papers at Moorland-Spingarn, still someday to be processed. And I am still actively doing research and writing, and frankly, I'm boring to myself. I would not go through that exercise. It's also a major part of any autobiography or memoir by me would involve the university and is a far more complicated matter than could be tossed off in a memoir autobiography. Now, I'm glad that you brought up the question of a history of the university. One of the things Dr. Nabrett had envisioned when he commissioned Howard University the first 100 years, he said he wanted a book to give the Congress. This is what Howard University has accomplished in 100 years. Now it's 150 plus. Dr. Logan was not going to write such a book. Dr. Logan was thinking of himself in the role of professional historian who is mainly responsible for analysis, for documenting conflict, the story behind the story, as it were. And there are two kinds of history. These are two different forms. One is what I call house history, where a university commissions a history and is obviously tilted toward what went well, what was their contribution to higher education, what did they do? That is not what Howard University the first 100 years is. It is a record of the Board of Trustees, which is not unimportant, but that's not the history of Howard University. The heart of the history of Howard University is what its alumni have accomplished. How did it affect the world? What difference did it make? That's what I had in mind when I was prompted to write the history of the Howard University History Department. Departmental histories are rather rare, and I was prompted to do that because I got angry. It was also anger that got me to do the Education for Freedom, the administration of Mordecai Wyatt Johnson. When the department got a grant from the Ford Foundation, a very substantial grant, we were able to hire then quite a large number of new faculty. And I detected early on an attitude, now I have arrived, progress is about to begin. They didn't know anything about the department. They didn't know anything about what had happened before. They did all the names that they might hear were mysteries to them, and they didn't think that much of the people who were already there. And so I decided as a project of my own that I would do this kind of thing because I had seen a model for it. There is a history of the University of Chicago Department of Sociology. And you understand, when you see that, what the importance was nationally of the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago. I hope that even if you are skeptical, if you look at the history that I wrote of the History Department at Howard, you will see this is what this department did. And some might surprise, some of the things in there. Howard University Department of History was the first history department to have any course on the Russian Revolution. It was the first to teach world history. Others were teaching Western civilization. Howard taught world civilization. Yes, it had a course on the history of the Negro, and no other department had it either at the time. But the point was we had a world vision, and we had some remarkable people, some who were not well known. They did not publish much. The man that I regard as having had the greatest historical mind in the department was Professor Harold O. Lewis, who was responsible for me getting interested in history at all. So I think this is something for the future, the documentation of the faculty. And I would think we would do a better job also on the alumni. So there is much to do. It's an exciting time.
Dr. Winston, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to have the interviews with you. It was a true honor and pleasure for me. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you for the invitation.